Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Critical Tech Talk 11 on the topic of speculative imaginaries and technological design. I'm your host, Marcelo Gorman, Professor of English, University Research Chair, and founding director of the Critical Media Lab, which is where I am right now. Before we get rolling, I have this long list of entities and people that I have to thank, including the Office of Research, all 6 faculties at the University of Waterloo. So Critical Tech Talk is about honest talks about innovation, and all 6 faculties are really interested in these kinds of critical approaches to tech. There's also Wendy Philpott and Olivia Vanderwall in the Faculty of Arts who help promote this event, Margaret Albrick and Deb Hergott in the Department of English who offer logistical help, and finally Chris Rogers, who is here behind the Critical Media Lab logo that you see, who's the Critical Media Lab manager and the man behind the curtain and the logo. So I mentioned that all 6 faculties support Critical Tech Talk, and this one is co-hosted by the Faculty of Science, which makes sense. We are meeting today on the Haldimand Tract, traditional territory promised to the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. So we often think of land acknowledgements as statements about events that took place in the past. But a key point of these acknowledgements is to support Indigenous sovereignty in the present. And some Indigenous artists and writers have chosen to address the challenges of the present by speculating on the future or on futures. I'm thinking about books like Sherry Dimaline's Marrow Thieves, a very well-known award-winning book, and Wagwishig Rice's Moon of the Crusted Snow, series. That's a great book to be reading at this time of year, if you're into that sort of thing, right, Cheryl? So such speculative futures, especially those that engage with science and technology, are the objects of study for today's guest speaker, Professor Sherryl Vint. Dr. Vint has literally written the essential science fiction book. At least that's sort of the title of her reference book with the MIT Press. And this is only one of her many books and articles on this and other topics, including biopolitics, posthumanism, and animal studies. And I took down the numbers. This might be close, Cheryl, but you probably won't want to correct me. 4 books, 37 articles in books and journals, 21 handbook chapters, 6 edited books, 3 special issues, and more than 24 reviews, review essays, catalog essays, and other reference works. How's that? Pretty good?
I don't count, but thank you.
What? You don't count? Dr. Vint is also the editor of the journal Science Fiction Studies and the book series Science and Popular Culture with Palgrave. I know firsthand as well that she is a caring and sought-after mentor for many graduate students. Well, let's just say that Sherryl Vint is the person people go to when they want an encyclopedic entry on science fiction. Dr. Vint's talk of about 20 to 30 minutes will be followed by a conversation with 2 respondents, Dr. Lauren Judge, a local artist and a recent PhD graduate from Wilfrid Laurier University, and Liam Rust, a Waterloo student, a Master of Science Waterloo student, working in biology at the university. So Professor Vint comes to us today from Warsaw, Poland, where she's on a Fulbright assignment, away from her home department at the University of California, Riverside. Sherryl, please take it away. I'm giving you the floor, the screen.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation and for that very generous introduction. I'm just going to share my screen and get my slideshow started. Thank you. And I want to begin by echoing things that Professor O'Gorman said about land acknowledgements and their importance especially for someone like me who works in a field that is interested in thinking about how the present came to be the way it is and what sort of different kinds of futures we might want to build from here. So my school, UC Riverside, where I normally work, is on the territories of the Kuya, Saranyo, Tongva, and Lusenyo peoples. They are caretakers of that environment, both traditionally and in the ongoing work of their descendants who are very involved with the campus. And we're continuing to discuss in the US context the issue of land grant universities and their responsibilities to and relationship with Indigenous peoples. But today I come to you from Warsaw, another part of the world that has its own history of displacements and different kinds of sovereignties. But my talk today is actually focused on the intersections of disability studies and science fiction. So in focusing on speculative fiction, which is really the center of all of the research that I've done, I'm really interested in it less as a genre or an aesthetic style, a set of tropes, and more in thinking about it as a rhetorical mode. It's a way of perceiving the world that foregrounds the contingency of cultural arrangements that we take to be natural. And it's interesting in asking this question, what if, and then exploring alternatives to our current socioeconomic and other cultural ways of doing things, as much as it is interested in projecting new scientific discoveries or new technologies. And although in my own research, I've really tended to focus on the science part of this broader umbrella term, speculative fiction, I understand science too as a cultural mode that's really engaging with questions of human futures and human values. And I think this is one of the places where understanding science fiction as a genre that's really about the impacts that science and technology have on everyday life can be an enriching research tool in these spaces. And I'll start out by acknowledging that science fiction is as polarized as the rest of public culture. So I'm going to focus on what I think are hopeful and examples of science fiction. But of course, I realize that there are other science fictions one could point to that are implicated in more reactionary or other regressive kinds of politics. So most of my research has been at the intersections between science fiction and the broader field of science and technology studies that I know many of the people here today work in that field as well. And it's recently begun to acknowledge the reciprocal and mutually reinforcing relationship between scientific design and larger cultural imaginaries, expressed elegantly in Sheila Jasanoff's idea of what she calls the socio-technical imaginary. And she defines, as you see on the slide, as collectively held, institutionally stabilized, and publicly performed visions of desirable futures, animated by shared understandings of forms of social life and social order, attainable through and supportive of advances in science and technology. And I really want to emphasize here, as I've highlighted part of the quotation, that this is really about visions of the future, so technologies of the future, but also understanding how they are entangled with what possibilities exist for social life and social order, that the two change hand in hand. So such socio-technical imaginaries can be articulated in many ways. Prospectus documents for VC funding, announcements of national infrastructure projects, corporate vision statements, but also genre science fiction. And here I want to suggest that such genre fictions are often more central to the way that the imagination shapes the direction of science and technology than is frequently admitted. Not only do the techniques by which any vision of the future is articulated today draw from the storehouse of science fiction images and themes, but science fiction can play a role as a critic of these futures being promoted as desirable, asking like desirable for whom? And in this way, I think it both is supportive of advances in science and technology, but also asks us to take a broader lens to thinking through the way that science and technology, its impacts extend beyond the area of research directly at hand. Such versions of the socio-technical imaginary then can offer us new shared understandings of forms of social life and social order, pushing that aspect of the definition as much as the new sciences aspect. It can require us to ask questions about what hegemonic forces seek to stabilize specific visions, and prompts us to recognize that technologies often come with unintended consequences that could perhaps have been anticipated had a design process taken the imagination more seriously. So the main reason I think science fiction occupies an especially influential space in this larger framework is due to the genre's affordances, particularly its emphasis on world building. Speculative fiction has long been recognized, and I won't get into all the arguments over defining what counts as speculative fiction or not. There's like as many opinions on this matter as people articulating them, but at the core of them all, it's a genre that is in some way different than the regular world. And it's a space whose difference from this regular world, our world, needs to be explained and contextualized. So in well-crafted science fiction, this compels the author to take a holistic view that represents change not merely as a new device that's thrust into an otherwise largely unchanged world, but rather good science fiction writers think through how the emergence of any new technology would begin to change other things around it, from patterns of work to habits of daily life, to questions of power and governance, to forms of family and community, to new ways of communicating or new modes of transportation or new energy sources. All of these things might shift through a technology that's not necessarily directed to any of these specific areas. So in this way, the future of skilled science fiction draws on the same critical insights that inform histories of technology, understanding how socio-technical change is cultural as much as it is material. And what's more, and I think this is where I see science fiction created in the fictional world as having a more robust capacity than kind of corporate visions using science fiction that we see in things like venture capital statements. It anchors these changes through a human point of view. It's a story about characters, their desires, and their choices. And thus it reminds us always to think at this human stage, not merely at the glossy advertising stage of technological marvels. And to try to give one brief example to make a little bit more concrete what I've been talking about in the abstract here, this is one set of instructions from a large number of projects that Arizona State University's Center for Science and Imagination has instituted. So in this particular one, this was a workshop where they brought together writers, artists, humanities scholars, social sciences, people working in policy, people working in engineering, and they asked them to think of a design for a solar future. But as you see from all these prompts on the slide here, they were not asked to merely think about what the solar technology would be and invent a cool technology that could imagine a future with solar power. But they were asked to think through all these sort of larger questions of, okay, if this technology exists in the world, how does everything else in this world work? Things from the ownership, questions of inclusion, questions of cost, questions of governance, questions of supply chain, both where the materials come from and where ultimately the waste ends up. So you see that this compels thinking that I'm calling world building, thinking not only of the technology, but how everything else potentially shifts around it. And thus how values are embedded in any design choice. So this makes the values be very upfront in thinking through the designs, not as an afterthought once you've already thought about your cool technology. So I would say that this example exceeds the usually limited frameworks for sort of futurology projections, and it draws on the power of science fiction world building to create a richer picture of a series of social changes that any technology can bring. They created an anthology out of this solar design project, but they've done multiple other projects on different kinds of problems and different kinds of technologies. Drawing on the affordances of science fiction as a rhetorical mode, projects such as this one show that the genre is more than just a set of images that might inspire new technologies, but it offers a way of framing those technologies and the changes that science and technology will bring through an emphasis on centering human values. So for me, speculative fiction is a mode of enquiry, and it's one that foregrounds the interplay among material innovations, fictional projections, and popular anticipations and anxieties. I come to these insights through my study of the genre and especially its connection to the socio-political project of utopian thinking. So this is why I'm emphasizing fictions I find positive. And in recent years, the importance of the imagination and affect in technological design has been theorized by a number of scholars who are working outside of sort of literary and utopian studies. And I see this as a very positive development. So to give just two brief examples, Peony Ravi and Anthony Dunn, they use the term design fiction, which was first proposed by Julian Bleecker, while Ruha Benjamin picks up on their subtitle of social dreaming in her work called Imagination, a Manifesto. And so both of these are seeking to use a term different than science fiction or speculative fiction. I myself stick with the term because I think it's useful to realize there's a long history of these kinds of images and representations that have been described by that term. But I share the sort of desire of scholars inventing new genre designations to think about the imagination as a material force, to focus on visions of the future as a site of struggle over what we might deem desirable and who counts as we in these articulations, and thus what we might choose to return to Jasanoff's terms to stabilize through our institutions. Dunn and Rabi suggest that taking the imagination seriously in design can offer up new perspectives on entrenched problems, encouraging us to think beyond designing something that might address a problem that will fix the social world as we currently find it, and instead to ask how design could help us think of different ways of living and being another kind of social world. And Benjamin ends her manifesto by suggesting that we can prototype new community and spiritual infrastructures, not only new technologies, as we work collectively to navigate the various upheavals. So climate change, increased migration, growing economic inequality, zoonotic pandemics, that Adam Tooze elsewhere defines as the polycrisis of our present moment. So it can turn a little dystopian too, I suppose. So I'm briefly going to talk a little bit about some of my work in this area now, and then I'll get into the disability studies focus with that frame of the imagination in mind. So my own work most recently has focused on biotechnology in a context of the commodification of aspects of our body and its genetic sequences. So even as developments in fields such as transplant medicine or synthetic biology might have medical and other benefits, I also think SF narratives help us see concerns around equality and equity of access to treatment, of a question of new skills that innovation might convey and to whom, and of the place of these technologies in a future that is being reshaped by innovation, so that we have to think about the undesirable consequences at the center of our speculations in our design choices to ensure that these negative futures or exacerbations of current negative aspects aren't reinforced. So my book that I published on this topic was organized around exploring what it means socially and political when biology is increasingly functioning as a mode of engineering. And one of the key developments that interested me in this work was a blurring of certain categories that have been foundational to modernity, and blurring between humans and animals, for example, in xenotransplantation, but also ways that some of these technologies like immortal cell lines are blurring boundaries between living being and lab tool. Perhaps even blurring boundaries between the living and the dead in speculative practices such as life extension technologies. Michel Foucault's work on biopolitical theory was central to my way of thinking about and framing this sort of new mode of modernity. And central to his ideas, as many of you will know, is this sort of shift from a logic of making die or letting live to a new logic of letting die and making live. So making beings live in particular kinds of ways through a new mode of biopolitical governance. But today I want to focus more centrally on a third term that Jasbir Pawar has introduced into this binary. And in her suggestion is that it's not simply that, as Foucault suggested, governance fosters a particular kind of life that it seeks to promote and then lets die through neglect other life that is not central to its aims. But instead, she introduces debility as a third term in between these two modes, and focuses on debility as a technique of power, and a technique of power that has a relationship to these historical conditions of exploitation through labor, through systemic racism, through colonialism. She writes, quote, "Disability is a product, not a byproduct, but a deliberate product of these exploitative labor conditions, racist incarcerations and policing practices, militarizations, and other modes of community disenfranchisement." So she calls this, where Foucault talks about the right to make live or the right to let die that, that power, governance power takes on. She talks about this right to maim. which doesn't foster life or death, but as she describes it, quote, um, is a source of value extraction from populations that would otherwise be disposable. So instead of simply discarding these populations, they're kept alive in a debilitated state to be of service to the sort of larger biopolitical product of the state. The larger arc of her work is to think through how debility is an outcome of both war and of dangerous labor conditions, that it produces a population that's still useful to the state, but weakened in its capacity to produce resistance to the state's power. But today I want to do something slightly different with this concept of debility as being produced by the social environment, and connect it to the distinction that disability studies makes between a medical model of disability, which sees the disability as something the body is or is not, and towards a social model of disability, which I think is closer to a socio-political imagination of disability, which thinks about how the environment does or does not produce barriers to full inclusion. So just as Puar notes that debility is a way that the state can turn populations that would otherwise be disposable into a source of value extraction, the discourses pertaining to disability and treatment often focus on the promise of technology to transform people whose disabilities might make them a burden on society, in quotations, into people who are, quote, productive members of society. So disabled people are quite right to note the eugenic logics that underpins this insistence on finding ways to fix them and their bodies, rather than focusing on changing physical and social environments in ways that might eliminate disability as an impediment to social inclusion. So for example, challenging the idea that disabled people can't be included in SF futures set on spaceships. A science fiction writer, Andy C. Buchanan, who wrote an essay on designing your spaceship, pushes us to think about designing spaceships in inclusive ways. The social model of disability, they argue, quote, carries a promise within it that there could be other worlds than this one. A promise that how things are is not how things will always be. It invites us to imagine not merely the removal of specific barriers, but to imagine whole other worlds. What would a world look like that did not disable you? What would a world look like that did not disable anyone? And this essay comes from a special issue of the fiction magazine Uncanny, which is entitled Disabled People Destroy Science Fiction. And I will quickly rush to unpack that title for those not in the science fiction community. It's part of a series of works. There was also a People of Color Destroy Science Fiction and Queer People Destroy Science Fiction. And it was a reaction to a sort of reactionary resistance to the fact that the SF community has been moving towards greater diversity for the past 15 or 20 years, greater diversity geographically, racially, in terms of gender, in terms of countries people are writing science fiction from. And so sometimes tensions between this more diverse SF and sort of older technocratic, mostly white and male SF exploded into public controversy. And there was an incident that I don't want to go into a lot of details about, but there was an incident, you can look it up, known as Puppygate, where some white male writers felt that social justice warriors had taken over science fiction awards, and all the awards went to the wrong kind of SF that was celebrating this diversity instead of basically to their SF. Their attempts to gamify the awards were sort of shut down by the science fiction community. And these issues using destroy science fiction, ironically, were one of the ways the community responded to this and articulated a different vision of what kind of futures we'd find desirable. So these destroy issues aim to disrupt ingrained habits in our socio-technical imaginary, to insist that linking socio-technical speculation with concerns about equity and inclusion enriches what science fiction can do. And thus these issues highlighted precisely the capacity of science fiction to prompt us to think about technology and its entanglement with larger issues of human culture. This issue on disability is especially interesting in this regard, I think, given the intimate links between disability and technological questions of prosthetics, their appropriate design, and their desired functionality. Science fiction about disability, and especially that written by people who identify as having disabilities, shifts our perspective from design as replacement for so-called normal functionality, and highlights instead how values are always embedded in technology, such that each design choice carries with it a vision of the social world in which that technology will be used. So the issue adeptly demonstrates how the tools of science fiction can reframe discussions about disability and medical intervention. Key themes emerge again and again that insist on the social rather than the medical model of disability, and that articulate desirable futures in which change is enabled by changing environments, not bodies. Several of the stories imagine a future in which work in space under zero gravity conditions, for example, is highly appropriate for people who have chronic pain due to conditions in which their joints and connective tissues are strained by Earth's gravity. Some imagine that capacities that are perceived as limiting on Earth can become sought after skills in space, such as the capacity to move other than through bipedalism. In one story by William Alexander, the fact that knowing sign language enables you to communicate without having to share atmosphere between the people who are communicating means that people who know sign language are particularly well suited for work on the moon, and it imagines a sort of moon-based future. Other stories use imagined futures of multiplanetary civilizations to reject the abled or disabled binary entirely, writing about futures in which the stresses of space travel or the loss of bone density due to prolonged time in space requires widespread use of walking aids such as canes and other kinds of prosthetics, thus transforming the entire philosophy of design in such societies towards greater accessibility. So as the editors of this special issue explain in their manifesto, which opens the issue, by turning our attention to the future, we were able to explore concepts and realities in the present and amplify them, connect them, highlight the ways they might become better or worse if allowed to continue on their present course. Through science fiction, marginalized people are able to say, we are here now and we will be there later too. And this latter point, I think, is especially crucial. It repeats multiple times throughout the issue. Fictional futures that show only able-bodied people imply that disability no longer exists in these futures, and this motif is repeatedly named as eugenicist in effect. In an essay reflecting on her attraction to working in SF as a rhetorical mode, for example, writer Marieke Nijkamp opens with this stark statement. You don't belong to the future, a guest lecturer implies in one of my classes years earlier when we discussed medical ethics and neurosciences. Not in those words, of course. Rather, her arguments are thought experiments, challenging the future of medicine and technology and the boundaries of acceptable humanity. And she goes on to explain that she gets this message, you don't belong in the future, by the emphasis on technologies that can fix rather than accommodate people that have disabilities similar to her own. So here we see how the medical model of disability intersects with what has often been labeled an ableist imaginary, prompting us to embrace instead the affordances of SF that aligns with the social model of disability and to picture a future rooted in values different from those of the present. So I'm going to conclude by briefly, I promise very briefly, discussing two stories that I thought were particularly interesting in this issue. The first is by S.L. Hoang called By Degrees and Dilatory Time. And it's about a protagonist who receives a prosthetic replacement for his eyes after cancer destroys his biological eyes. The story engages with a longer history of SF representation, especially cyberpunk, that imagines such replacement body parts as cool transhumanist enhancements, conveying greater abilities such as seeing beyond the visible light spectrum, or being able to mirror a computer-like vision that can enhance images, zoom in, these kinds of things. You've, I'm sure, seen them in science fiction films. But Huang's protagonist doesn't find that his experience matches this fiction. He notes that in some ways his eyes are better than human ones, but in other ways they're in fact worse. They're somehow dissatisfying. They flatten things and make him feel emotionally disconnected. His gamer friends are envious that he can, quote, level up and become one with the machine. But initially, such high resolution images are fatiguing rather than enabling, and he stops gaming for a while. But eventually, he becomes accustomed to his new eyes, and he notes that they are, quote, just different from his organic ones, more enabling in some ways and less in others. And one of the reasons I was particularly attracted to the story is because I think that it resists this sort of tendency to glamorize prosthetics that we often see in transhumanist discourse in some cyberpunk future. But it doesn't sort of do that by being anti-technology or anti-prosthetic, but it reframes the values around which we understand it. And the second story I want to discuss briefly is by Marissa Lingen, and it's called This Will Not Happen to You, a story written in the second person about a new fungal plague. Each paragraph begins with, quote, "This will not happen to you," end quote, as the story then walks us through how the plague emerged, how at first there was no treatment and the victims didn't understand what was happening to them. And then later, the early treatments were experimental and only partially successful, creating new kinds of pain and new disabilities rather than instantly restoring or extending function. Only by the third round were prosthetics successful, a perspective which effectively resituates our relationship to new medical technologies. The story never suggests that such technologies are not valuable or desirable, but it asks us to remember those on whom the research is based, a stage that's often skipped over in techno-optimistic visions of cool technologies to come. Lincoln's story both acknowledges the value of medical intervention in the refrain of "this will not happen to you," because now there are antifungal treatments that stop before the damage is done. Now there are prosthetics to restore function when needed. But it also cleverly reframes an ability-disability binary at the very end by reminding us that they are always on a continuum. Its last sentence is, "And none of this, definitely none of this, will happen to you. Unless the spores change again, unless the technology changes again, unless anything at all changes," end quote. So to conclude, I hope this talk has shown you that speculative fiction can be a useful hermeneutic in relationship with technological design. I focused on this specific example of disability, but I think it's applicable to a wide range of technologies. And most importantly, I think many of the fears that people have regarding technological change, and often speculative fiction embodies these fears, are fears that are more about the social and economic context in which the technology is introduced. They're described as fears of technology, but it's really fears of this social side that science fiction helps us illuminate. Speculative fictions urge us to reframe interventions into longer scale historical temporalities, to reframe them in complex exchange with the rest of the culture, and to focus on the human scale of daily life. And most of these issues come down to questions of power, especially in relationship to unintended consequences, to stigmatization, and to exclusion. And so I'll end by saying I'm very grateful to be in dialogue with the Critical Media Lab and to talk with you about how we can integrate more holistic thinking into design. Many of the students from that program I know go on to work in environments where all the financial incentives work to promote us towards a future that's opposite from this critical stance that I think the science fiction and the media lab can cultivate. And I'm looking forward to hearing your ideas about how we might address some of these challenges. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Cheryl. Everyone out there is clapping. We just can't hear them. So that was great. I have so many questions about spores and prosthetic technology and power, but this isn't my show. So I'm going to introduce our respondents right now. So we have Liam Rust, as I said earlier, is a Master of Science candidate in biology at the University of Waterloo. They've previously completed their MA in my department, English, focusing on science communications. They're currently working on projects with the interdisciplinary group RISE, the Residential Development Impact Scorecard for the Environment. I've learned that Liam, an expert in the biodiversity of cities, spends a lot of time thinking about urban ponds, which seems like a great setting for a science fiction novel, an urban pond. And then we have Dr. Lauren Judge, an interdisciplinary geographer, currently working as a research associate at Wilfrid Laurier University. Lauren also completed a Master of Arts at the University of Waterloo. Her PhD from Laurier is in critical geography. Her dissertation, which is made up in part of environmental art projects that she created, is titled Making the Pluriverse Visible, World Making on the Saugeen Peninsula. A great title for a work of speculative fiction, too, I think, Dr. Judge. So, Lauren, Dr. Judge, I'm going to ask you to get the ball rolling here and respond. It can be a response, it could be a simple question. The point here is to just have a conversation. And anyone who would like to ask a question or make a comment, we don't have the chat turned on, but please use the Q&A that's available in this webinar. Okay, Lauren, take it away.
Well, seeing as how my research is sort of grounded in the non-human as well as the human world, I wanted to ask Cheryl, just, I mean, out of interest, and just you can just comment on this. And I read a little bit about this in your book, Science Fiction, about the connections between, or maybe missing or limited between disability studies and animality, and how disability studies is predominantly still just about the human and not as inclusive as we think it is, because we are sort of excluding the animal or the non-human world from that. Yeah, I don't know. I just thought I find that fascinating, and I've noticed that too, it's an exclusion that's common. But yeah, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. I probably don't remember what I actually wrote in my book, and I didn't reread it. So if I don't address the part you're wanting me to, please prompt me again. But the thing that first comes to mind, and this is something I remember writing about in this book, is that I'm really interested in thinking of sort of the human body as not a single species environment. And the sort of the framework, because I wrote an earlier book about sort of animals and science fiction, and I was really interested in sort of ways that we could think of sociality as a more than just human species project or endeavor. And then disability studies similarly sort of draws attention to the fact that we design our society in ways that often exclude the full participation of disabled people, but we could do that differently if we thought of a social model. So where I guess the species question would come into that for me is that there's ways we can think about our bodies as in biological exchange with other species, and that this also relates to our health, and then sort of the continuum of healthy, unhealthy, or able, disabled. These things are continuums rather than binaries. And you could even sort of extend that even further to questions of environmentalism, which I know is something Liam is interested in, that if we're keeping other species in sort of healthy ecological balance, that serves our health as well. And so that we can't sort of separate these things out into different domains through a sort of human supremacist or able-bodied supremacist or any of those other kinds of binary logics of modernity. So does that get at what you're asking about?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah.
The great opening, I think. I can see Lauren coming out of your interest in
Yeah.
pluriversality, and I liked the segue to Liam now because Liam, what are you looking at in those ponds? You're looking at all kinds of ecological webs, and tell us a little bit about, what do you think of this talk, and what responses do you have?
Yeah, so I focus primarily on stormwater ponds and kind of the ponds that are situated in developments that are often seen as infrastructure rather than being habitats themselves. And so some of my research is actually trying to get scientists on board to reimagine these pieces of infrastructure and even municipalities to reimagine them as kind of bodies of environments and ecosystems from a more like ecological approach. And one of the things that was mentioned before was this idea of bodies as sort of biological exchange and environmental exchange. And I kind of wanted, I guess, to touch or even open the question up about these ideas of like environmental ecological futures. Like we think of the genre of solar punk, for example, of being this kind of grandiose future. But with my work in stormwater ponds, oftentimes there are externalities that are often kind of unchecked within these kind of utopian ideas. And I kind of wanted to open it up because with my work, we see a lot of infrastructure being built. That's great, but it requires maintenance, which can often be at the detriment of environments.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is why, to me, world building is this like very powerful like hermeneutic, because if you do it well, and I will sort of rush to say lots of people, and especially in sort of very mainstream, popularly circulating science fiction, don't necessarily do it well. So I'm not claiming all science fiction does this, but if you really do it well, you precisely have to think of those questions. You're like, okay, we could have this like great a nuclear powered future where there's energy to do anything, but then we would like poison all the plants and there'd be no oxygen and we die or whatever. That's like a very simplistic example. But I think that we have to, that you really have to build your world, like expand all those layers out and think through the temporality science fiction enables. So it's not just what would it look like when this was new and shiny and functioning, but it's like, how are we going to sustain this in the long term? But where I think maybe science fiction, we need some different kinds of science fiction than have been dominant, and certainly some of these examples exist, but we also have to have more kind of uh, uh, improvised, I guess I want to say, or small scale, or less glamorous visions of how we're going to live in kind of sustained ecological exchange. There maybe has to be a little dirt in there. It's not all going to be sort of shiny plastic white spaces of the future as in 2001, because the reality is that if other species are going to thrive, which is what we need for us to thrive, that we need some space for things not to be quite so antiseptic and efficient and optimized and all those values that have really sort of taken over in the 21st century.
Lauren, I'm wondering, you've done a lot of work with dirt and rocks and such things. I'm wondering if you've thought about the role of the role of dirt in the future in thinking about world building.
Well, having been somebody who's worked in nature preserves, where you're invited to learn, but the ideal way is not to introduce any new errors. It's in science fiction, we have this, I mean, we seek utopia. We want to see what is better, right? What if, so that we can find the better. And we expect that of authors. We expect that of science fiction authors to present to us, to something where it's better. But every time it seems as humans that we come up with this technological innovation, whatever it be, and we try to introduce no new errors, we do. Ultimately, we're not perfect. We're imperfect. I mean, we even as, the debates rage on, as Marcel, with AI, like we have these expectations that technology is going to make our life better, but it's being programmed by imperfect beings. It's so I don't know. I really do think that, the best science fiction, or that at least captivates my imagination, is not perfect. It does show the complexities in life. There are all of these multiple layers of complexities, and it shows the author has done a lot of systems thinking, um, you know, and as Sherryl said, like, and also underlying that, the values that have programmed those systems or our interpretations of those systems. So yeah, it's more of a comment than a question, but I just, yeah, I'm always struggling with that, introduce no new errors. There's actually a rule of thumb that I learned when I was doing editing and writing consulting. As an editor, that's one of the first rules you learn. But it's damn near impossible, because it's such a personal process too. Yeah. And then the other rule of thumb that I've learned as an environmentalist is, just because we can doesn't mean we should. And I love it when stories explore that as well, you know? Yeah. Anyway, that's what I have to say about that.
Thanks, Lauren. Earlier on, Liam, you said a magic word, I think, to me anyway, in context of science fiction, which is infrastructure. And Sherryl, I know you've thought about this, and you watch any science fiction film or read a science fiction novel, and there's this big obsessive focus on infrastructure and on, you know, these kinds of grand infrastructural complexities and dreams that humans build, and that they become less idealistic in the science fiction setting. So I wonder if Sherryl, if I know you've reflected on this. I wonder if you want to say a little bit about, you know, the infrastructural studies aspect of science fiction studies, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Is a great question. And I mean, that question, but also this whole conversation is really reinforcing to me something that I believe anyways, which is the importance of interdisciplinary conversations around these things. And I know science fiction writers, they're doing their research and they're interested in what's going on in whether it's like infrastructure development or AI or environmental studies or international relations. But given the sort of way the socio-technical imagination does have this really material power, I think that I would like to see more interdisciplinary work where people engage with possibilities across these sort of spaces. And that includes sort of seeking to shift our socio-technical imaginary. The one of the things I like about Sheila Jasanoff's definition is this piece about institutionally stabilized, but I also will want to kind of put it under some pressure. So like who's stabilizing it and to what ends, and that infrastructures enable certain kinds of ways of life and preclude others. And if we start thinking critically about that, we could also sort of think of a relationship between, do we want the sort of cool science fiction thing that we saw in the movie and it looks really cool, and then you have like a sort of ersatz version of it in life and it seems great and you want it, but the movie never asks you sort of like what's the supply chain of that really cool thing in the movie, or like what were the labor conditions that made it. And so I think, you know, we could put some grit into the sort of fluid fantasies of some of those cool infrastructure futures that we see, especially represented in the visual realm, and think through like what it actually takes to materialize them. You know, what way might we want to sort of institutionally stabilize instead of visions of sort of large scale, fast, efficiency, vast, like a lot of those terms dominate the sort of socio-technical imaginary right now, but different terms could be cultivated, I think.
I, I like this. I think all of you in a certain way, Lauren, I know I've read your dissertation. Liam, you mentioned earlier about, you know, trying to bring these ecological views into people who are more infrastructurally focused and focused on, you know, the fast innovation and efficiency and so on. And this makes me think of who all of your audiences are, and who are you are you speaking to, and who are you trying to convince of something. And I have a follow-up question, but I want you to speak a little bit about who are your audiences, who are you trying to speak to with your work. Liam, do you want to start with that?
I mean, it really depends on who I'm talking to. Like in on one day, I could be talking to developers who, they want to build a suburb, but they are building it close to a natural water course. And they might say, we need to have this capacity for water flow, and we have these targets that we need to that we need to hit. But then I go into the actual, environment, and I see people who live in these neighborhoods who are concerned with the biodiversity of the pond. So in terms of communicating, it's really kind of not only dependent on the end sort of person you're communicating to, but it's also generally how you want to shift the understanding. So the idea of like a stormwater pond, for example, the word pond itself kind of has this kind of blurred connotation between natural and infrastructure, and these kind of blurred lines are almost liminal in a sense. And so communicating it can be quite challenging. But when you add that kind of speculative fiction perspective, which is what end up doing when I talk with people in the field, is how would you imagine your life if you were able to access this pond? Because there is life in it. People think it is natural. I have the unfortunate duty of whenever I see someone swimming in a stormwater pond to be like, get out. It's really polluted. I wouldn't recommend you swimming in it. But if they can explore it in a way and kind of reach out to that kind of social aspect of how is this piece of infrastructure also contributing to your ideas of nature, it's very complicated, but very important to kind of shift their rhetorical thinking of the piece of infrastructure into something different.
How far are you willing to go with that kind of shifting their thinking, their future-oriented thinking? Would you present them with some kind of far-flung design? Would you consider, or what would happen if you presented with some kind of far-flung design fiction about the future of stormwater and what happens when you swim in the pond and so on? Would you?
I think I think most people would think of like The Simpsons. They'd come out with like a third eye, like a three-eyed fish sort of thing. But I would ask them to think of not only the benefits that it's providing for their neighborhoods, because these do protect in cases of flooding, for example, um, but they also contribute to um, similar levels of biodiversity towards their natural counterparts. I mean, in Waterloo region itself and even southern Ontario, 95% of the wetlands are being developed and they're usually not replaced. And so these kind of act almost as refugia, despite their water quality and their habitat quality being low. They kind of
Mhm.
act as refuge for not only the biota that exists in them, but also a refuge for people who don't have access to nature. It's kind of hard to get to Algonquin when you don't have the ability to go to Algonquin. And so access to nature in cities is also something that's really important. It's a equity point as well. Um, and so I would imagine them to kind of think of from a perspective, could we make this better? We're not going to make it utopian, but we can make it a bit better.
Lauren, who is your audience when you're thinking of speculative futures and world building? Who do you most want to listen to you?
Oh, everybody. No. Um, I
Plural.
yeah, so I guess there's sort of three audiences that my research I was hoping to reach with the idea of my research expanding on that geopolitical concept of the pluriverse. I was hoping to reach anybody who is imagining a post-development world or a post-growth world, or who anybody who sort of engages in those kinds of studies to think beyond that as a human-centric concept and more so as the possibilities of it being more than human. And by more than human, I'm not meaning more than human in terms of technology. I'm meaning more than human inclusive of non-humans, whatever they may be. Um, the other audiences were, artists in general or creators, to understand that, our creativity is um, is not singular, it's co-creative. We're often working with other agency um, in our environments to create what we create. These ideas don't just come out of anywhere. Like creativity is standing on the shoulders of the giants that came before you and playing to influences and finding nuances and telling new narratives that string together and braid together different knowledge systems. So in that respect, creativity is co-creative. And then the other would be my own need to share um, with other geographers our need to be more interdisciplinary. My own field is notorious for claiming to be interdisciplinary and then not being. And so I wanted to demonstrate that, we can have very cool, very interesting, imaginative findings, things coming out of research that combines things like visual arts and geography. But, you know, inject your preferred fields here and see what comes out of it. Like, yeah.
This line of questioning is headed toward you, Cheryl. It's a setup. I'm really interested in where science fiction, the rubber of science fiction hits the road, let's say. And I know not just science fiction, but the kind of work you talked about at ASU with the solar project, for example. So imagining, speculating about futures of solar from this interdisciplinary kind of perspective. And it's a great idea, a great project, potentially mitigating unwanted, undesirable outcomes of new tech development. But is there a pipeline from this kind of work to actual research and development, to the corporate world? So, and this is a more general question about, are people paying attention to the critical side of science fiction? And is there evidence of this? I know it's a big question, but
Yeah, I mean, is there evidence of this? There certainly are lots of people doing empirical studies where they interview a bunch of subjects about what they think of science fiction and like and if they think it has any relationship to the one I was reading earlier today had to do with the Terminator actually and autonomous weapon systems. So I won't go too far down that road, but there's certainly, I'm not someone doing that kind of empirical ethnographic work, but there are people doing it. So I think the sort of where science fiction rubber meets the road it does relate to this question of audience to me. Like one of my, if I'm thinking like who my audience is, I think one is fellow STS scholars, to suggest that the imagination actually is a lot more important than is acknowledged at times. And I think that people working in design, this is one of the reasons maybe for this desire to create new terms rather than call it science fiction. You have to call it design fiction or some other kind of fiction, because you want to sort of signal you're serious doing a real world thing and you're not, you know, inventing Buck Rogers ray guns. But I think that there's more porousness there, that there's an affective dimension to this sort of very popular mainstream science fiction, which is maybe not at all a realistic spur to an invention, but it's sort of shaping an ethos. And so it gets at the values piece of the technologies in ways that I think we could speak about a little bit more. But the larger kind of part of your question, like, is anyone paying attention? That's sort of what I was trying to get at a little bit in my conclusion too, and why I'm really grateful for this chance to be in dialogue with you in the Critical Media Lab, because I mean, to a degree, I really worry, no, right? Like one of my other audiences in terms of breaking down this science fiction binary is people who think that a lot of the so-called real technologies we have, and right now all the sort of hype is around AI. Like to pretend that that's not influenced by science fiction is not really a tenable idea to me. It's deeply, deeply influenced by ideas from science fiction, not on the kind of design level in the sense of like, oh, science fiction told us how to build this, but in the sense of what kind of world we imagine where AI does things for us. That's really deeply influenced by science fiction, even if it had no plausible ideas about how AI might be achieved. And I think we fail to pay attention to that at our peril, because it smuggles in a lot of other baggage about like hierarchies and power and who's valuable and who's not. And, you know, if there's a world in which AI is doing all these sorts of needed kind of labor for the people who are the users of AI, like what has happened to the rest of the people in that world? In like some of the early pulpy science fiction, they're just not there. And you know, I think that imaginary does have a kind of resonance in some of the current research cultures. So this is a question that concerns me when you see sort of business, for example, and places have departments now of innovation studies and things like that. Or I read an article recently where someone took Blade Runner as like a really great model for how we could build more biotechnologies. And I was sort of like, If you start thinking of science fiction only as a storehouse for inventions you could, get an app for and then get some VC funding and then become a billionaire, then we're at that sort of torment nexus point. And so this is sort of part of my proselytizing, is just to remind people other kinds of science fiction are out there and we could be doing other things with this powerful capacity to imagine.
You've just answered a question by one of our audience members, which is great. Another great segue, because I want to give the audience a chance to ask their questions. And we'll go for another 15 minutes or so here, if that's okay. So Kavi asked about the potential for appropriation inherent in the speculative mode. And he did mention the torment nexus. He mentioned companies and individuals who advocate for hierarchical, anti-ecological, hyper-capitalist futures adopting and appropriating the work, Star Trek, Ian Banks or Douglas Adams stuff. So I think you just addressed that pretty well, that it happens either subconsciously or quite deliberately, this kind of appropriation of these motifs and also of the power structures that are represented in science fiction. Sometimes are meant to be ironic, but are taken literally in the corporate world. I have another question here from Cameron Shelley, who actually, I hope you don't mind me saying, Cam, works in our Center for Society, Technology, and Values, and is asking about how do you employ science fiction in literature or film in presenting these issues in classes. It's a pedagogical question. So I guess if you're teaching science fiction, it's pretty obvious, but if you're teaching something like a course in innovation or an engineering class or something like that, do you have any thoughts about this, or does anyone have any thoughts about this? Yeah, that's the question.
Were you going to answer, Liam?
I'm trying to think of an example I gave my students when I was teaching them like population genetics and community ecology. Um, I think one of the things that I've often cited when teaching my students in terms of, I guess, animal ethics, or like handling animals with respect, despite them being, we collect them in the field, we put them in ethanol, we try to give them the best death. uh, Feels very like macabre to say the best death, but to try to treat them with respect. And I often cite this 70s film, Fantastic Planet, with these animated, the drugs and the humans being these like Tear, for example, where the main character treats him like a pet or kind of uses him in a way that is not necessarily ethical. And whenever I try to get them to understand, these animals or these organisms are here to help you learn, like I often use and cite speculative fiction and science fiction in order for them to understand that point. Um, However, with a lot of younger students coming in, a lot of my science fiction references don't often go off like that. I think maybe I need to update my science fiction sort of uh, vocabulary, but they do often understand when it comes to, say, like, the Terminator or other, like Blade Runner, for example.
Great.
Yeah, and I could just add, I mean, obviously how I teach, I can easily bring science fiction into my classes because I teach science fiction, but I do always try to connect it to something in the real world for students. Like I try to lean into this material effect that the imagination has. Because I think that even if we don't get exactly the same technologies that are envisioned in science fiction, or if we get a version that's sort of like it in both cases, you can really sort of show how a certain set of values was attached to that technology in the science fiction and get them to think critically about whether some of those carried over in some like real world instance of a similar technology. So I do try to be not just sort of read science fiction for science fiction's sake, but to show the students how it is part of the way the technologies that they take for granted were imagined before they existed and had an impact on how they ended up materializing, and that they could have materialized in different ways but didn't. And that's that contingency, I think, is the space for like critical reflection.
Lauren, how about you?
Yeah.
How you use speculative stuff in your teaching? So
Yeah, well, I mean, speculative geographies is a thing. And I guess one of my most recent examples was I was teaching a grad seminar in human geography, and I wanted to show my students that, you know, we are speculating on the futures, and that's a really great way to do geography, especially if you're thinking about what possible solutions there are to things like climate change, or if there is even a solution anymore. And I use this video that I found online that is how AI envisions the next 400 years for humans. And the student, every time I show this to my students, the looks on their faces just, you can see them morph like every 50 years, all of the major shifts that are that they intend to happen. But what's really cool, and I have to point out to them to remind them that this video, you know, this is programmed, right? It's programmed by AI, which was in turn programmed by humans, or before that. And that you can actually see, like in the video, imagery that's similar to Blade Runner or similar to other movies or sort of formidable worlds that have been created that people recognize, because they're just pulling it in and braiding it together and developing these narratives. And we can still learn from it. And the future that AI envisions for us is that essentially within 100 years, we're going to have to live underground because, you know, if we keep going at this exponential rate of growth and productivity, I mean, it's inevitable that we're going to run out of resources and we need to find a new way to do this. But then there's a rebirth as well that it envisions, which is really interesting. And then there's this incorporation of biomimetics and things like that into design. So it's really interesting, but it's I love to sort of inject things like that into my teaching to sort of first get my students to wake up to possibilities that they haven't thought about, that are not being discussed in the academic dialogue and the articles that we're discussing in class, but just to also remind them that imagination plays a role in our work. Like you have to use your imagination. We can't just keep recycling the discourse. We have to inject new life into this. So. Yeah.
thanks, Lauren. So we have living underground. Has anyone seen the silo? Speaking of infrastructure, the silo. Yeah, we don't want to live there. So we have a few questions now, Sherryl, directed to you regarding disability studies and activism. So I'm going to try to synthesize these for the sake of time, and then we have a final question I want to address. But the first question was regarding the difference between medical and social models of disability. I think you addressed that a little bit, and maybe you can discuss that more in responding to these other questions, which have to do with the role of space for non-disabled folks sharing speculative fictions around disability. Should there be a place for engaging with current experiences of disability before diving into speculative fiction? So I think this is another sort of an issue of appropriation where disability community is named and claimed by those who know little of our lives outside of their clinics and labs and so on. And then I know I'm throwing a lot at you now, but the last question is regarding, I think I was alluding to this with this pipeline to actual production of technology, which is, what about the ways in which disabled communities want to both envision the future and materially change the present? So this has to do with critiques of design thinking that merely speculate and ideate and leave the difficult work of materializing new structures to others, if at all. So a lot there to chew on. I'm sorry for throwing you all of that at once, but what are your thoughts? Any thoughts?
Any thoughts? You might have to prompt me if I don't address all the questions, because it's kind of late in the day for me, which is not a quick time for my brain. But I mean, the social versus medical model of disability, what I was trying to highlight in the stories I selected to discuss was that that I think undoing the binary is sort of part of what speculative fiction can help us do. It can help us, it's not just like, yes, you have technology and it fixes disability, or no, you don't do anything about disability and you fix the world, but you could imagine ways that both are true, and that you can, and I think this maybe ties in with the last question a little bit too, in the sense of whose voice is being represented in some of these stories. So the issue of Enquiry magazine that I took these examples from, the call for contributions to that was limited to people who had a disability. And so all those visions were created by people. I mean, there's a wide range, obviously, of different kinds of disabilities. And so not everyone shares the same kind of disability or the same kinds of concerns with the built environment and how it's disabling. And this is something that the editors discuss quite a bit in the introduction to the issue, is that disability is also not a monolith. But I think that this question of sort of asking those struggling with ways that the environment and or the technologies don't serve them to envision the futures that they want, whether that's better prosthetics to overcome some impairment, or it's a change to the environment such that the condition is no longer impairing. And it doesn't have to be one or the other, it can be a mix of both. And so that this is sort of why increasing the diversity of whose voices are represented in the Imaginaries is important, because there's a long history of science fiction before the question of disability and disabled authors was foregrounded, that always imagined sort of disability as something to be fixed, and always imagined the coolness of the kind of prosthetics by which you could fix it. And that's why, for example, S.L. Huang's story seemed really, really interesting to me, that you could have these cool cyborg guys, but in fact, it's not sort of what that whole transhumanist discourse imagines. And there was a third part of the question, but now I've already forgotten.
It was about the difficulties of moving from
Yes.
visions to
So
actual material changes.
yeah, I mean, and perhaps I'm not communicating this very well, but this is in fact sort of part of what really concerns and interests me, is that it's one thing to imagine, wouldn't it be cool if we had a technology that could do X? And then you make a movie and it looks like that, or you write a book and it looks like that. But better versions of science fiction and sort of interdisciplinary conversations that take the imagination seriously, both, I think, can really have to also do that difficult work of, it's not just cool if we had like a device that could I don't know, like read aloud everything to us as we walk through the world, so that we would always speak all languages all the time or something like that. I don't know, I'm not it's probably because I'm living in a country where I don't speak the language very well, that's the example that came to me. And that's, having a vision that would be cool is not the same as knowing how to make that happen. But it's the starting point for a conversation that could include multiple voices and perspectives in the ideal world. But too often, I think, especially when it's like science fiction is sort of advertising, science fiction is VC funding, all you get is like the cool image. And this is the great future you're going to get if you just give us money to make this thing. And that the sort of decontextualized cool tool sort of sits out there alone. And I think that's very sort of damaging as a way to use science fiction. And what, again, I was suggesting at the end of my talk, and what I suspect your students and you also struggle with, is we do have these critical perspectives, but then you want to go out and get a job, because we all need to eat, and you end up working in an industry, and all the financial incentives like push you towards the cool decontextualized thing. And they don't really want you to fully think through all these difficulties and questions and barriers and equity issues, because that's not really profitable for the company. So, I mean, I think that's another place where we really need to do some thinking about how it is we can take these insights and have them be more than academic analysis, how they could get some real traction in industries that are not set up to care about these kinds of questions for the most part, I think.
And that's a great setup for the last question for today from Katie Fulfer, which is about optimistic science fiction and this call for more optimistic science fiction. And can optimistic science fiction pay attention to this social, technosocial imaginary, those social and political? Can you be optimistic and critical at the same time? And I don't know if we can answer that. And I know it's past 10 o'clock for you, Sherryl, but maybe you can all say a little bit, maybe say something a little bit optimistic or or critical if you'd like to finish off, everyone, and we'll let our audience go home.
Well, I'll say something really quick because yes, I am fading. That rather than optimistic, I'd probably want to use the term utopian. But coming out of utopian studies, I mean utopian in a really specific way. I don't mean utopian as in the perfect world. I mean utopian in as the sort of horizon of always trying to make the better world, which is like a project you never finish, right? You're always trying. And I mean, optimism, ever since Mark Andreessen published his Techno-Optimist Manifesto, optimism has a political valence in this techno space that I'm not going to sign on to. So I will stick with the critical.
Yeah. If anyone looks that up, watch for the Nietzsche quote and look for its original context. Anyone else want to speak to optimism?
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
go
go
ahead.
ahead, Liam. No, you go ahead. That's okay.
I was about to quote something similar to Cheryl with like kind of striving for the horizon, but I think about it from like the queer ecology standpoint with like Jose Esteban Munoz, who's like, you're always striving for that horizon. But as someone who works in pretty nasty ecosystems, I want to strive for the mundane. So if we can get a science fiction writer and some waiters just to get like mundane levels of kind of realistic science fiction, I would be very happy.
Thrive for the mundane. I like it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Laura?
I think I have to agree with Liam there, and I agree with what Cheryl said. I think that we need to use our imagination to do better, but to always never lose sight of the complexities. Where disability studies explores things like the introduction of prosthetics and how these things keep getting more technologically advanced, and that's great. But are we designing those to be more productive, or are we dehumanizing people or the subjects in the process, right? And like we need to understand all these nuances, and I don't ever want us to lose sight of that. I want us to embrace the complexity and continue exploring along all the different possibilities. Keep it multidimensional, keep it interdisciplinary, because I think that's more interesting. Yeah.
Keep it joyful,
Yeah,
everyone.
you can do it
Uh,
joyfully too.
that's the motto of the Critical Media Lab. Whoa, Liam, thanks for that.
I didn't know that was going to happen. So
I manifested that. Everyone, you are excellent. Thank you. We're so fortunate to have you here with us tonight. Sherryl, thanks so much for your time. We hope to see you again. I know we will. And thank you, Lauren and Liam, and to all of you out there for joining us today, and to Chris for keeping it all going. So yeah, I'll let everyone go into their speculative imaginary evening, and have a great weekend.